De Quincey's mature literary style, which manifests itself in Confessions of an English Opium Eater, is nothing like any prose style we've seen thus far in this class. De Quincey's style, unlike the conversational style or the plain style of the Wordsworth and Coleridge we see in the 1790s and early 1800s, De Quincey's style harkens back to the 1600s in England, to a kind of stylistic mode that Samuel Johnson called the metaphysical. And this metaphysical mode is often associated with the Baroque. The Baroque being a term, architectural term, that we use to describe rather bizarre, outlandish buildings, very complicated buildings, dizzying buildings, labyrinthine buildings. Samuel Johnson, describing the work of early 17th century British poets like John Donne, said that these styles were characterized by the yoking together of two radically unlike things. And this, of course, can give you a kind of epistemological vertigo. Two famous examples from Donne. One would be his poem Valediction Forbidding Morning, where he likens himself and his wife to two poles of a compass, the kind of compass you would use in geometry class in grade school. Donne says, okay, you're going to stay in England, my beloved wife. I'm going to travel to the continent. We will be apart. However, because we are both poles on the compass, wherever I go, you will go. So we will be connected. So to imagine two people on different continents, well, not different continents, different parts of Europe, separated by an ocean, as a tiny little compass, well, that's rather bizarre. More famously and wittily, in The Flea, Donne is attempting to seduce a young woman unsuccessfully, but then he notices a flea, and he imagines that the flea has bitten her, and therefore has some of her blood inside of him, and he imagines the flea having bitten him as well. And he says, look, what is it to make love but to mingle, to make two one? Well, we've already been mingled inside this flea, so basically we've already had sex, so let's do it again. A very clever way to try to seduce someone. Now, there were very important prose writers in the 1600s who developed this kind of metaphysical conceit into an extremely elaborate kind of style that we can again liken to the Baroque, which appears outlandish, bizarre, dizzying, labyrinthine. Two of the primary practitioners of this kind of style would be Burton with his Anatomy of Melancholy, and Sir Thomas Browne with any number of his prose works, Religio Medici, The Garden of Cyrus, Urn Burial, to name three. So De Quincey looks back to these kinds of writers as the masters of his style. And you'll note in Confessions of an English Opium Eater, generally speaking, his style in the early straight-up memoir parts of describing him in Oxford Street with Anne, are fairly simple and linear. But by the time we get to the pleasures of opium and the pains of opium, the structure fragments, and we're not pulled along by a narrative. We're simply hurled into various opium visions that are not connected through logic at all. And the style itself becomes appropriately sort of hallucinogenic. It becomes outlandish and bizarre, Baroque. So I'll give you two examples of how De Quincey's style works within this tradition of elaborate prose. So one would be it's one of the visions from The Pleasures of Opium. Remember, he would take opium and he would go hear music, or he would just go kind of walk around London on Saturday night. And here he describes his return from London to his home, or return from a walk in London to his home in London. He says this: sometimes in my attempts to steer homewards upon nautical principles, by fixing my eye on the pole star and seeking ambitiously for a northwest passage, Instead of circumnavigating all the capes and headlands, I had doubled in my outward voyage. I came suddenly upon such knotty problems of alleys, such enigmatical entries, and such sphinxes riddles of streets without thoroughfares, as must, I conceive, baffle the audacity of porters and confound the intellects of hackney coachmen. So here we see two rather shockingly unexpected, well, shocking is a bit of an exaggeration, two rather very original, unexpected comparisons. First, as he makes his way through London returning home, suddenly he turns London into an ocean, and he turns himself into a navigator trying to get back home. But then that's not enough. He switches the ocean to a labyrinth. And not only a labyrinth, but a labyrinth peopled with sphinxes. So already one rather far-fetched metaphor, the city of London as a vast ocean on which a navigator is lost, becomes a labyrinth in which someone like Theseus might be lost, but also it becomes a place of the Sphinx, riddles, where someone like Odysseus will be challenged. So this is one technique that De Quincey uses. I call it intensification of association, where he'll begin with a simile or metaphor that is already fairly far-fetched, and then quickly he'll shift to another metaphor or simile that is associated with the first one. And sometimes he can go not just twice, but 3 times, 4 times, 5 times. So intensification of association. 1, 2, the idea of the metaphysical conceit, comparing London to an ocean, and then comparing the ocean to a kind of labyrinth. Definitely a comparison of two things that are generally unlike. Well, in addition to these two techniques, De Quincey also likes paradox. And this comes forth in one of the most famous passages in all of Confessions of an English Opium Eater. And this is in Pains of Opium, where he describes how the Orient, as he envisioned it, affected his visions. Remember, he allegedly saw a Malaysian man come to his cottage, and this experience of the Malaysian man caused him later on to have these dreams of the Asian world that were quite horrifying to him. Certainly, from our position, this is an example of Orientalism, or the kind of imperialistic reduction of the other into some sort of commodity of fear and desire. But here's what he says. In my opium visions, after having seen the Malaysian man, I soon brought Egypt and all her gods into my dreams. I was stared at, hooted at, grinned at, chattered at by monkeys, by parakeets, by cockatoos. I ran into pagodas and was fixed for centuries at the summit or in secret rooms. I was the idol, I was the priest, I was worshipped, I was sacrificed. I fled from the wrath of Brahma through all the forests of Asia. Vishnu hated me, Shiva laid wait for me. I came suddenly upon Isis and Osiris. I had done a deed, they said, which the ibis and the crocodile trembled at. I was, for 1,000 years, in stone coffins with mummies and sphinxes in narrow chambers at the heart of eternal pyramids. I was kissed with cancerous kisses by crocodiles and laid, confounded with all unutterable slimy things amongst reeds and Nilotic mud. Whoa, amazing. So we do see conceits here. We do see this intensification of association. We also see paradox. He says, I was both the priest who worshipped, and also I was the worshiper who was sacrificed. So paradox would be in play here. Very complicated syntax is in play here as well. It was in the other example I gave. Long, complicated sentences. Also, an abundance of allusion. It's a very scholarly, erudite kind of style. So we see him alluding to all kinds of myth here, Egyptian myth, Hindu myth, and so on. And finally, I would highlight the musicality of the style. There's a heightened euphoniousness to the language. So even though this is prose, it reads very much like poetry. I mean, the sonic qualities are very marked and very mesmerizing. So those are just some qualities that distinguish De Quincey's style from the style we see in Wordsworth or Coleridge or Lamb or Mary Lamb. And the style is appropriate in its exoticism and its strangeness to the exoticism and strangeness of the opium visions that it defines.